Huh? Okay? Great. Rob's over there. All right. Rob, can I get you over here? Thank you.
Did you want to try to sit there?
No, thank you.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're honored to have two titans in the neuroscience community, Professor V.S. Ramachandran and Professor David E. Presti. David E. Presti is here to discuss his new book, Mind Beyond Brain. I'm just going to mention a few nuts and bolts, and then Professor Ramachandran has graciously agreed to introduce David Presti. Sir, are you looking for a seat? There's what? There's an open seat? Where?
In the corner. High top in the back of it. In this right
Okay. Well, where are you sitting?
He's going to go sit there.
Oh, you're sitting over there. Okay. And we're starting now. Okay. So, Professor David Presti is Professor of Neurobiology, Psychology, and Cognitive Science at UC Berkeley, and also teaches neuroscience to Buddhist monks and nuns in India and Bhutan. He has doctorates in molecular biology and biophysics from Caltech and in clinical psychology from the University of Oregon. He's also the author of Foundational Concepts in Neuroscience, A Brain-Mind Odyssey. And we're extremely honored that Professor Ramachandran, who is the director of the UCSD Center for Brain and Cognition, has agreed to introduce his colleague.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis. I'm obviously delighted to be here. It's a wonderful occasion, and I hope you enjoy the evening. Whenever I wander into Dennis's bookshop, I feel my spirits elevated, because it's almost like an oasis in the cultural desolation of Southern California. So it's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful that bookshops like this can flourish, survive and even flourish in this day and age. And I hope it's been going on for 20, 30 years now, and I hope it continues for another 20 or 30 years. So, and I'm honored to introduce today's speaker and kick off this event. Professor David Presti has been a friend, close friend, and colleague for over 20, 30 years, from the days at Caltech when we were both postdoctoral fellows doing research in neuroscience.
40 years.
40 years.
40.
Denial going on there. But if you look at the history of ideas in science, especially in neuroscience, but science in general in the last 200 or 300 years, you find that there have been major upheavals, what we call revolutions in thought, and a way of thinking about the world, about the cosmos, and about a relationship of human beings to the cosmos. The earliest of these, of course, was the so-called Copernican revolution, the notion that the Earth is not the center of the solar system, certainly not the cosmos. In fact, it's a little speck of dust spinning around the sun. This is very humiliating in the beginning. Then came Darwin and the Darwinian revolution, saying we're not this highly intelligent, evolved being, which we are, of course, I don't deny that, but in fact we are hairless, neotenous apes, who happen to be a little bit cleverer than our cousins, leaving a little bit more babies than them more often. That's all we are. We're lucky in leaving more babies up on the treetops, and here we are having this discussion. So the Darwinian revolution, and then there was, of course, the Freudian revolution, said Freud, which is that what we think of as a conscious life, everything we do in our lives consciously, quote unquote, in fact is governed by a cauldron of emotions, passions, which drive our behavior, which were really driving our behavior, but which we're not conscious of, which we subsequently rationalize to serve our purpose. Now, we could add a fourth revolution to this list of three, which everybody knows about this list of three. The fourth revolution is, of course, the neuroscience revolution. Namely, as Francis Crick said once, we're a pack of neurons, each of us. That the brain is made up of 100 billion little wisps of jelly, with ions fluctuating across the membrane, sodium, potassium, and calcium ions. And all your passions, your emotions, your values, your love life, your ambitions, your career, everything, your social life, even what you regard as your own precious self, which contemplates the future, and your so-called free will. All of this is a result of the activity of these little specks of jelly. There's nothing more. This, again, is very humiliating if you think about it. But perversely, we enjoy it. The most popular books which sell a lot, as Dennis probably tell you, cosmology, emphasizing your irrelevance, or Freudian books on Freud, not anymore, but certainly in the old days. And evolution, of course, is very popular. But why is this? Why do we all enjoy being belittled? Why do we enjoy being, insulted in this manner? And there's no simple answer to that, but I think we can invoke a Freudian answer. Namely, if you're nothing to begin with, you're just a puny little hairless ape sitting on a dust particle, then death is nothing to be afraid of. Because you're nothing special to begin with, what does it matter if you pass on to it? So this is sort of underlying, but I don't want to wander in that direction. But here we come to the boundary between metaphysics, philosophy of metaphysics on the one hand, and neuroscience, hardcore science and neuroscience on the other hand. And one of the foremost practitioners of this discipline is here with us today, Dr. Presti, David Presti.
Hey Dennis, can you turn the sound up?
It's as high as I can get it.
Okay, we can't hear.
Okay, I'll speak a little bit more slowly. Louder. Okay, louder. The interface between science, between brain and mind, and between science and metaphysics, which is very difficult territory to negotiate, is something which David Presti has done very admirably in this book. Not by arguing that you can say metaphysical, supernatural phenomena, psychic phenomena are just bullshit. They're nonsensical. Like hard-nosed scientists might do that. Or you just go wholesale, get into all the crystal healing and all that. Two extremes. What David Presti has done, I think, is very appropriate, very ingenious, which is to say a future metaphysics of today's metaphysics, philosophical questions, will be assimilated into a future science, a more mature science, which will in fact begin to explain all these psychic phenomena, so-called psychic phenomena. That's his central thesis, and including, if I'm not mistaken. That's what he'll tell us about a little bit today, and I hope you enjoy his presentation. Thank you.
Wow. So thank you very much, Rama, for that introduction. And yeah, we met, I believe, in 1979. So 40 years this year. Wow. Rama and I were both postdocs together in the same lab at Caltech. We've stayed in touch ever since. So it's a real privilege to be here. I am not a long-time author. My first book was the neuroscience book 3 years ago. And I'm not on the road doing a book tour. I've done one other book reading. It was last week in Berkeley, for this book. It was published by Columbia University Press back in October. But it's a real privilege to be in this store because I completely agree with what Rama said. I can see, without being part of the community here, that this really is a beautiful intellectual and cultural and social nexus for a large community of folks, and it is really it warms my heart that places like this are flourishing these days, and we can hopefully have more of this in the future, and it will continue. So thank you for inviting me, Dennis, and for being part of this lineage in this store. I keep looking at it, it was like just packed in here, and that Indian, I keep thinking, that's real. Can I take a picture? Okay. Big smile. So wild. And I teach at UC Berkeley in molecular biology, and I have a class, Introduction to Neuroscience, right now that has 650 students in it. So I'm used to like crowds, but there's a different energy. So let me say a couple of things. So I wrote this book here on introductory neuroscience, and this is basically the class that I teach at UC Berkeley. I have taught for 20 years, and it's a rigorous and readable introduction to cellular and molecular neurobiology, which really doesn't leave out the details. So I mean, you read, and it doesn't require any sophisticated background because this is a class that has freshmen and sophomores, and they don't have science background, and some of them think they hate science, and especially chemistry. There are 135 molecular structures in here, so it's done in a way that hopefully makes it interesting and comprehensive. And it starts off with HAL, the computer, in 2001. It kind of ends with HAL 2. But the point being that there's a lot we know from neuroscience about how our bodies and nervous systems and brains operate. And there's an enormous amount we don't know. There are huge mysteries at all levels. And the book ends with a chapter on mind and consciousness and reality, and really keeps the mystery front and center, and outlines a few different ideas for ways forward to expand the science of mind. One way being keep doing what we're doing and investigate more about the properties of the brain and so forth, and another way being to develop a more sophisticated science of the subjective, of actually the direct analysis of mental phenomena themselves. Another way being to pay attention to the interface between fundamental physics and human interaction. There are all these hints already from quantum physics that the interaction of humans in making measurements is doing something really strange. And physicists have been arguing about this for nearly a century now, since the beginning of quantum mechanics. Bohr and Einstein argued about it till the end of their lives. So this is something that's unresolved in quantum physics. It often gets spun into all kinds of crazy stories, but there's a real problem there that suggests there's mystery that may, in the next, whatever the next big theory in physics is, it may address the interaction of the mind and the world in ways that go beyond what we know right now. And finally, another way is to pay attention to phenomena that are completely inexplicable and mysterious and outside of the explanatory range of our current biophysical models of reality. And that's the direction I explore in this. So this Mind Beyond Brain book is really the sequel to this, even though it may not look like it. And here the cover of this book is a brain, and it looks like a bunch of neurons sort of firing in there, but it's actually a Hubble Space Telescope picture of two colliding galaxies, the antenna galaxies, that my wife Presti, sitting here, noticed looked like a brain, and I really wanted to get some kind of like juxtaposition of the cosmos and the brain, and that works perfectly, so it lines up really well. So this other book also has a cover that was painted by a Nepalese artist that lives in Berkeley, that we arrived at his store one day, and we were thinking about cover topics. This is my wife and I. And Christy, you had this idea of something that was kind of atomic or cosmic, and but a juxtaposition of Buddhist art and science in some way, and then we walk into this gallery, which we hadn't been in for 2 years, and there's this painting sitting right there. So that's that cover. For this book, I'll start out, I mean, sometimes at these book events, they do readings from the books, you know, so I'm going to read something just to get the conversation going, but it's actually going to be something I didn't write. It's the epilogue. I mean, the epigraph, not the epilogue. So this is the epigraph. There are 3 of them, 3 epigraphs. And the first one is by a philosopher from NYU, Thomas Nagel. And he wrote a book a few years ago called Mind and Cosmos. And in that book, he says, "The spectacular progress of the physical sciences since the 17th century was made possible by the exclusion of the mental from their purview. To say that there is more to reality than physics can account for is not a piece of mysticism. It is an acknowledgement that we are nowhere near a theory of everything, and that science will have to expand to accommodate facts of a kind fundamentally different from those that physics is designed to explain. It should not disturb us that this may have radical consequences. Materialism remains a widespread view, but science does not progress by tailoring the data to fit a prevailing theory. He wrote this book, Mind and Cosmos, very rigorous philosophical exploration of the limitations of our contemporary science in kind of capturing the nature of the mind, and also of the limitations of how to understand mind simply and solely in the context of biological evolution. And even though he goes out of his way in the book to say, I am an atheist, I'm not positing some theist principle here or something like that, he got accused in the pages of places like the New York Times of being a creationist. So it's really, you're in dangerous territory when you start discussing some of these kinds of subjects. So here's the second quote from Max Planck, one of the founders of quantum physics. Science cannot solve the ultimate mystery of nature, and that is because in the last analysis we ourselves are part of nature and therefore part of the mystery that we are trying to solve. Now, there's some kind of deep enfolding of the mind and what we think the physical world is in some way. I think Planck was kind of more profoundly correct in that statement than he even appreciated, I think. The third one is from a Buddhist, Indian Buddhist philosopher who lived 2,000 years ago, Nagarjuna. There does not exist anything that is not dependently arisen. Therefore, there does not exist anything that is not empty. And what he's basically saying there is that there is no intrinsic essence to anything independent of everything else. Everything is completely and interdependently originated in a profoundly deep way, so that it makes no sense to separate out something from everything else. And that includes separating out mind, and by mind here I mean our capacity to have awareness, to have conscious, experiential, subjective awareness. Why aren't we robots? Why aren't we just mechanical, biological machines, which maybe we in part are? However, we also have this awareness that is deeply inexplicable according to our physical science. And in the way that we do physical science 500 years ago, starting 500 years ago with, at the time of Copernicus, followed by Kepler and Galileo and Descartes and all those folks, they intentionally separated off an analysis of experience because nobody really knew how to deal with it. It was getting into the territory of the church, which was very powerful. These folks were all practicing Catholics. They didn't really want to tread on the authority of the church. Galileo got in trouble for getting too close to that. And so they made a decision to basically not deal with the mental part of anything. We will just deal with the observable world as a kind of physical machine, including the body, and see how far we can get. And that's what we've been doing for a few centuries now. We've gotten really far. It really works well. It's an amazingly successful paradigm to have pursued that method of analysis, and it has. And one of the ways in which we're very impressed with the successes, because it has given us all of our technology, and we love all those gadgets and airplanes and capacity to really kind of predict and measure and confirm and all of that. But there's no reason, and this is what Nagel is saying, there's no reason to believe that paradigm will be sufficient for helping us really deeply appreciate the nature of our awareness itself. Because there's a way in which that has created the whole thing in a way. All we know is via our consciousness, our awareness, We notice patterns in the world through our awareness. We have created very successful scientific, mathematical, physical theories to explain those patterns that we observe. And then we have elevated, because of their success and their predictive success, we've elevated them to a kind of level of reality. That must be real because it works. And yet it all started with our awareness to begin with. So there's some kind of enfolding there that we don't, it may be impossible to extract ourselves from that. But what I maintain in this book is that we have to at least now acknowledge that it's there in order to really get to the next level of more deeply developing a science of mind. So let me do one other reading here, and that'll be from the end. And then I'll talk about the arc. So this is the coda. This book is motivated by the notion that the contemporary encounter between Buddhism and science provides a forum in which to productively explore a more central role of mind and consciousness in our description of nature. Going back to the 1600s in the days of Galileo and Descartes, Western science has separated consciousness off, removed mind from the equations of biophysical science. Mind and consciousness are taken to be something akin to add-ons, emerging from and secondary to physical processes in the brain and body, processes that can be understood to operate independently of mind. The defining hallmark of what we call science has been its objectivity, some kind of idealized view from the outside. A closer look reveals that this cannot be the case. Mind and consciousness necessarily shape everything we believe we know about reality, and yet for all practical purposes, science operates with an illusion of objectivity, as if mind can be separated off and its irreducible centrality ignored and even forgotten. This has been a powerfully successful trajectory and undoubtedly will continue to enjoy varying degrees of success. However, at the same time, we believe that limits have been reached, limits that will only be transcended by embracing the central role of mind in nature. Within current science, quantum physics already hints that consciousness, or experience at least, is inseparable from our characterization of physical reality, but the coupling between observation and physical reality, the so-called measurement problem in quantum physics, has no agreed-upon metaphysical interpretation or solution. Biophysical science, including quantum physics, seems to be at an impasse with respect to progress into the deepest questions concerning the relation of mind and the world. What can we do toward opening to the centrality of mind in nature? We do not claim to answer this question, nor do we contend that there is one right way forward into new terrain. Science is best served by pursuing diverse paths and methodologies. In this book, we essentially propose but one, that the Buddhism-science conversation is an important context in which to discuss the empirical study of phenomena suggesting that aspects of mind may transcend the physical body in ways not presently captured by the explanatory framework of biophysical science. Buddhism takes seriously the centrality of mind and nature, honoring the co-created and interdependent enfolding of mind and world. This, we believe, is the key aspect of the beauty, power, and potential of the encounter between Buddhism and contemporary science. So the way this book came about is about 35 years ago, the Dalai Lama, who's been avidly interested in science since he was a child, had the idea that a conversation could be a conversation between his tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, which is deeply interested in the nature of the mind and in the nature of reality, a conversation between that tradition and modern scientists who are also interested in the nature of mind and reality, neuroscientists, cognitive psychologists, physicists, that maybe something really useful would come from this. Here you have two different worldviews that are each interested in these same questions. They're using completely different sort of methodologies and have different histories. Maybe something interesting would come from a dialogue. And because he was the Dalai Lama and well-known and had some influence, he was able to get a few scientists together back in the late 80s, and they had such a conversation, and it really took off. And then for a number of years now, ever since 1987 actually, there have been regular meetings that where small groups of select neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, physicists, more recently educators and other sorts have come together to dialogue with him about these things. Lots of books have come from it. It's been institutionalized. And occasionally, if you go back and you look at the transcripts of these things and so forth, you know, the Dalai Lama will bring up subjects like, well, you know, in my tradition, we believe that there's reincarnation. You know, we believe we have empirical data to support some small child kind of knowing a lot of stuff they really shouldn't know unless they really had access to material from somebody else's life. I mean, how can that be studied? And the scientists will all kind of look very sheepish, and you know, they'll either say, well, that's just a religious belief, you know, that can't possibly, that science has proven that nothing can happen after you die, and which of course science has not proven. We don't know anything about what happens after we die, or you know, they might have been interested but really didn't know anything about what may or may not have been done or so forth. So it went nowhere. And so, you know, the Dalai Lama very quickly got it that, you know, this was not territory that was going to be dialogued about. So the dialogue has been used in ways that have been really productive. Whole new areas of scientific interesting research have opened up. You know, mostly we hear about this through the things like the brain changes when you meditate, you know, and that you can, there's neuroplasticity, and that this is good, and there are all kinds of empirical studies now that show that even very simple practices that are derived from ancient Buddhist meditation traditions are good for physical and mental health in various measurable ways. So this is all great, but it's very limited to the kind of bigger picture of the kinds of things that can happen. Because in the big picture, here we have what we've done is we've taken this several millennia, this very sophisticated tradition that's several millennia old, and we've taken, and then we've put it into the categories that we already know. Like, well, what can we do here? We can take people who are good meditators and stick them in a brain imaging machine and see what's happening in their brain. But there hasn't yet been any purchase for the other half of the dialogue, and that is, well, how can we take some of these ideas from that tradition that don't make any sense to us and actually do something with them? So, about 20 years ago, the Dalai Lama said, well, look, I'm not going to be around forever, and I can't be the only guy that is the conversant part of from the Buddhist side. We need to have some more scientifically educated people who are skilled also enough in the terminology and the practices of science that they can also kind of take over part of this dialogue or expand the dialogue. So the Dalai Lama has always seen this as a multi-generational project. So he asked that there be an educational structure that started to be installed in some way in the monastic institutions of the Tibetan Buddhist monasteries and nunneries in India, where there are about 20,000 monks and nuns as part of the diaspora, and start teaching science. And this did not go down well. You know, the leaders of the monasteries said, what do you mean teach science? We don't have time for that. We got enough to do, and it's not very important anyway. Look what it's done to the rest of the world, you know. So and stuff like that. But through a program started, planting the seeds. I crossed paths with that program in 2004. So for 15 years, I've been on and off teaching in India, and then most recently we did the first projects in Bhutan and in Nepal at monasteries and nunneries. Last summer we were in Nepal and taught neuroscience of perception to 60 Tibetan nuns that didn't really know any science at all prior to our 5-day encounter. So what's happening now is that in all the major monastic centers in India, there are actually science centers. And there are enough educated monastics in science that they've sort of taken over the development of their own educational trajectory now. So it's been absolutely fantastic. And so what this will mean is that in the generations to come, there will be large numbers of very deeply educated Tibetan Buddhists that know the philosophy and practices of their own tradition, and they'll know enough science to really kind of create projects in collaboration with scientists from the West, which is already happening, which is all good. So all these monastics, when I encounter them, are all interested in these like weird phenomena that are not explicable. And so about 10 years ago, we had a little one-day meeting here in the United States at a Buddhist retreat center in Virginia with a Tibetan teacher there, with myself and a group of people from the University of Virginia who have been studying anomalous phenomena for 50, 60 years. And so, for example, there's one guy there, Bruce Grayson, who studies near-death experiences. He's the world expert on near-death experiences. He just retired, and he'll be, for future reference, he'll be writing a book. He told me this will probably be the only book I ever write, but he wants to write a scientifically rigorous but really readable, book that details his 45 years of studying near-death experiences. And so there are a lot of inexplicable things that happen in near-death experiences. So near-death experiences when you have either a cardiac arrest, so your heart stops, or a near drowning, or a lightning strike, or you don't even have to be physically injured. Sometimes you're just in either an accident or an almost accident where it feels like you're going to die, and in a fair number of those cases, people will report things like being out of their body, where they're actually looking down on the whole scene. And this is, of course, completely inexplicable. And if any of that is happening, it really changes everything. It doesn't mean that anything we know right now about brain science is wrong. It just means it's not enough to account for all that may be going on experientially. So there's him. There's another psychiatrist there, Jim Tucker, who studies small children who, at the age of 2 or 3 or 4, just spontaneously talking in great detail about somebody else's life that they shouldn't know anything about. And they have documented, Jim Tucker's predecessor was a psychiatrist by the name of Ian Stevenson, who's now deceased, but he studied this for almost 50 years, and he had documented more than 1,500 cases, mostly from India and Sri Lanka and other places in Asia and the Middle East that had cultural systems where they believed in the possibility of reincarnation. And so when small children talked that way, they took it seriously. Whereas if it happens in the United States, which it does, it tends to be discounted or kind of like, okay, that's enough with the imaginary playmate or whatever. But the guy who's there now, Jim Tucker, is actually not as interested in going to other countries to study it. He's interested in collecting American cases, and he's written a number of papers and a couple of books. So he has a section. He has a chapter in here. Bruce Grayson put a chapter in here. There's Emily Kelly and Ed Kelly, who study other aspects of death, apparitions, and dreams that happen around death or serious injury of someone close to you. And there are just thousands. There are endless numbers of well-documented stories like this that go back centuries. And so the idea being that if we're open to the occurrence of these kinds of phenomena, it changes the way that we start to think about everything. And that might be a very useful thing to build into a future science of how we expand the way we think about mind and reality. And that's one of the threads that I believe is a good direction to pursue for a future expanded science of mind. So that's mostly what I'm dealing with in here, and I try to do it in a way which is rigorous and grounded and empirical, There's no pretension of having some kind of new theory of everything or anything like that. And nor is there any belief system that I have around something like reincarnation. What I believe is that the data suggest that there's something really weird going on. There's something really weird going on that is so far beyond our capacity to explain right now that we really have to think out of the box in a bigger way if we're going to move the science forward. And this is, of course, all very consistent. You were talking before about shamanic traditions from the Amazon that engage with nature in a way, with a worldview that is very different from ours, and there are compelling reasons to believe that they actually have access to ways of communicating with other parts of the world that we have no clue about in our biophysical science as it exists right now. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong about it. It's just limited in various ways. And why wouldn't it be the case that our science right now is limited? I mean, if it was 200 years ago, we would have had no way to describe how this thing works, or let alone a cell phone or something like that. That would just be complete magic, woo-woo. What do you mean? You have something, you just talk into it, and they hear you on the other side of the forest, whatever. I think it's all about being open-minded and empirically observant of what's happening. Maybe, is that a good place to kind of open it up to questions, or how does it usually run here?
I have a question.
Okay. Does that work?
Could you discuss the example of the tennis shoes on a different floor above surgery, and when someone had an out-of-the-body experience as an example, a potential example of the existence of mind beyond the physical body?
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, the tennis shoe example is in here. It's one of the stories that Bruce Grayson had connection with. But let me tell you about another variant of that I just read, because coincidentally or not, I mentioned that Bruce Grayson is working on this. He just developed a book proposal for his book, and he sent it to me for comments. And it starts out with this story of when he had just recently gotten out of medical. Well, he had finished his psychiatry residency, and he was working in an emergency room. And so he was the psychiatrist on call for this emergency room. And he sits down to dinner, and he's like at home, and he's eating spaghetti. And so this is back in the 80s, before cell phones, he had a pager, and his pager went off, and it kind of startled him, and he spilled some spaghetti on his tie. And he's always very nicely dressed with a tie, like Mama. So then he goes into the hospital, and a young woman had overdosed on something and was unconscious, and her roommate had brought her in, and then he was supposed to do some kind of psychiatric evaluation. She was unconscious, though. She was having heart fluttering and arrhythmias and stuff, and so they were monitoring that in the ER. And so he and the roommate were in another room, having a conversation about what had happened and so forth. The roommate didn't know what drug she took. She thought maybe she was using some kind of psychiatric medication. She wasn't sure. And so, Bruce went home. The next day he comes in the morning. The young woman has woken up, so she's now stabilized. They have a conversation. Turned out she had taken an overdose of an old antidepressant medication, one of the tricyclic antidepressants, which are very dangerous in overdose. And that's what had happened the night before. But then she proceeded to say, and I know you had this. I know that Susan that was her roommate, told her this, that, and it told you this, that, and the other thing. And Bruce said, "What do you mean? You were unconscious in the emergency room being monitored on life support, and I was in the next room talking to your roommate, and they hadn't seen each other since then." And she goes, "Yeah, I saw it all." and not only that, you were wearing such and such a tie, and you had like a splotch of sauce on it or something. You did not have on anymore, and so that blew his mind, so to speak. You know, so she had, her awareness had been out of her body, whatever that means. That's the mind beyond brain. It's like whatever that means. It had been out of her body in another room. And cognizant of all this stuff, and then she recalled it. So that stuck with Bruce. He very, he pointed out that he couldn't talk about this to anyone. I mean, here he was, a young graduate who recently gotten a job out of his residency, and if he had said this to anyone else, and if his colleagues or supervisors, he would have been considered, an unreliable doctor or a nut or something like that. And so he didn't talk about it. And then a few years later, he ends up at the University of Virginia, head of the psychiatric emergency team there. And there's a guy named Raymond Moody who had finished his internship at the University of Virginia and was working in the emergency room and was collecting all of this data on near-death experiences and working on a book. There was no term near-death experience then. It was before, this was in the 70s actually. And then Moody published his book, I believe, in 1975, Life After Death, or Life After Life. Life After Life, which became an enormous, international bestseller and really introduced this term, near-death experience, into the English language. And Moody shared a lot of that conversation with Bruce Grayson at the time, and then Moody went on to do something else. He's that kind of guy. He got interested in something else and went off in another direction, and he basically turned over all of his data on near-death experience stuff to Bruce. And so then Bruce kind of took up the mantle and has become the world's leading authority on it in the last 45 years. So that's an example, to respond again to your question, Dennis, that's an example of how somehow this young woman's awareness had decoupled from her brain and body and was able to get information in some other way. And of course we have just no way to actually get a handle on that with how we conceptualize things right now. So I think that's where we have to be driven by the empirical phenomena. And if this is documented over and over and over and over again, which it has been, by reliable informants, then it's useful to at least take that possibility seriously.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've heard Dr. Brian Weiss speak twice, and he's told stories similar to that when he first started. But more importantly, I heard a psychologist speak up in L.A., and he told the story how he had a patient that was feeling about killing his wife. When he took him back to the 10th century, he had killed his wife in the 10th century. Now his wife, who was sitting next to me, said he took her back. She had an issue in her life, took her back, and once she knew about it, she felt better. Now the other thing is that was the founder and former director of the wellness community here for cancer patients, and you're probably familiar with the wellness community for cancer patients. It now is called Living with Cancer, and it exists all over the world. And people in psychoneuroimmunology, people who can focus on their minds to healing their cancer, if they can get rid of all the junk in their head, they have healed their cancers.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you.
David, can you give a précis of the question so people can get a sense of what the question was? Or just part of it.
Okay. Well, the first part was sharing some stories that some reports that you've had about similar kinds of anomalous phenomena around returning to other time periods or something like that. And I don't know. There are a lot of stories. I think you don't know where to draw the boundaries. What they've done in Virginia is they have confined their study of these things to very small children, 2, 3, 4-year-olds, that spontaneously start talking about things. Because once you get into adults and you get into hypnotizing folks, then there's just all kinds of things that can happen, and that doesn't mean that they're not accurate in the same way, but it just becomes more fuzzy. Whereas if you stick with the small kids, that kind of narrowed the variance of the kinds of stuff. So that was the first part, and then you drew attention to the profound impact that our mind has, that our beliefs our experience, our personal subjective experiences, the profound effects that these have on our body. And that's, of course, something that is becoming more and more appreciated, that there's no disconnection. There's no disconnection between mind and body in that sense, that whatever is going on in our body, it's intimately interdependent with what's going on in our mind. And a lot of that may be accounted for by mechanisms that are all physiological. And so there's this amazing stuff now going on, like the vagus nerve, which is one of the parasympathetic nerve pathways that innervates the entire gut area and chest area, sending signals back and forth to the brain. Seems to be interacting with the microbiome. So, we have all of these bacteria and microorganisms in our gut, hundreds of billions of cells, minimally, and they're secreting things, and they're changing the properties of the nervous system that then get passed to the brain. And so they're just profoundly weird and interesting connections going on. And so, absolutely. And what I hypothesize about the whole mind thing is that it goes even beyond our own bodies, that there's a deep interconnection of whatever we mean by subjective, mental, conscious awareness. There's a deep interconnection of all of that with basically everything. That's what science is telling us in a very small, kind of one step at a time way, that the more deeply we look at anything, the more it's interconnected with everything else. That's the whole beauty of the microbiome, of all the recent stuff that's come out about the communication between trees and plants and fungi and forests. It's like there's no separation in nature. And I believe that our mental, the piece of us that is considered mental, is just as woven into that in ways that we don't know how to capture.
And Brian Weiss has written several books about this.
Yes, and so this is in the air. So that's why that's one of the pieces of evidence that I cite as one of the pieces of information I cite as evidence that we're really poised at the threshold of not only a huge scientific revolution, but a whole sociocultural revolution, because this is all wrapped up with the humanities, with spiritual and religious traditions. As soon as you start talking about mind being detached from the body, well, what's the difference between that and a soul, or what people call spirit? It's like you get into all of, and that's why Descartes 500 years ago said we can't go there, because if we go there, it's going to piss the church off, and then I'll be under arrest like Galileo. So we're just going to leave that out of the mix.
Does this line of thinking that you explore cause you to intersect with people who are serious about ghosts?
Well, yes, I have met such people, but there's one guy, you should look him up, David Hufford. He just retired. He was a medical anthropologist at the University of Pennsylvania. There's the place where the people are serious about ghosts are mostly in the anthropology community, because the anthropologists take seriously the stories of the people, the cultures that they interact with. And who knows, I don't know anything about ghosts, so I can't go there. But, we often use terms like ghosts to explain things that we have no idea what's going on. So I have talked with a number of people over the years that have stories like a very close family member who was separated in distance by hundreds or thousands of miles, was in a serious accident, or was killed, or died of natural causes, but in an unexpected way. And then they see an apparition of this person. They literally see something in the room in front of them, as if this person is there saying goodbye to them. And then later they find out that something serious had happened at that same time. Now, is that a ghost? I don't know. People call the more technical term for that is crisis apparition. And there's actually a chapter by Emily Kelly in there about those kinds of things. So it is, it's all connected maybe to the same thing. Consider, just say this, pay homage to another local La Jolla, John Smithies. I don't know did you know Smithies? Yeah.
A gracious gentleman.
A gracious gentleman. So a giant in the history of some of these fields. So John Smithies, who died just 2 weeks ago. Yeah, he was 96, is that right? Brahma's just finishing writing a obituary for him, which will be on the UCSD website, is that right? So wonderful man. So he's 96 years old, a British psychiatrist, really pivotal in a number of different ways. You know, one of the famous stories in the history of psychedelia is, of course, Aldous Huxley's experience with mescaline in the early 1950s, and from which he wrote a book called The Doors of Perception, which was very influential in kind of introducing the notion of psychedelic substances to the bigger culture and so forth. That was in 1954. So Huxley had received the mescaline and been guided in his mescaline experience by a psychiatrist by the name of Humphrey Osmond. And Osmond was another British psychiatrist who was a colleague of Smithies. And Huxley had actually contacted Smithies, and they were discussing mescaline, and they were discussing... but the reason Huxley first knew Smithies is because both Huxley and Smithies were really interested in the so-called paranormal. That is, and by paranormal, which is a word that gets used in the subtitle of my book, although I didn't really... I had to kind of... that was Columbia University Press's idea. I mean, believe it or not, they had never published a book that had that word in the title. And I said, well, I don't know, you know. but because I just wanted Mind Beyond Brain, then I had a really boring subtitle, Deepening the Dialogue Between Buddhism and Science. But by paranormal, which when it was introduced into the English language in the early 1900s, it was meant to be a legitimate academic category of investigating things which were beyond the current explanatory capacity of our physical science. But of course it's been completely corrupted by all kinds of popular culture associations with all kinds of woo-woo and bad movies and, you know, all this kind of stuff. So, but I'm using it in the way that it was originally intended. A phrase that I like even better is supernatural, 2 words. And that was coined by my friend and colleague Jeff Kripal, who was a religious studies professor at Rice University. And so supernatural means, so the space is important because it's natural. These are natural phenomena that occur, whether we want to believe them or not. But they're super, you know, they're kind of outside the ordinary realm of everyday experience. Both Smithies and Huxley were interested in these kind of phenomena, and they had met at some meetings in the early 1950s, 1950, 51. So they were already corresponding about that stuff, and then Smithies was also working on mescaline with Osmond, and so it went off in that direction too, and the rest is history. So Smithies had proposed in the 1960s, written several papers, and he kind of revisited that in a paper that he wrote just a few years ago. He was still writing multiple scientific publications per year, you know, at the age of 95. A real inspiration. And he proposed the idea that what if there were more than just the 3 dimensions of space and the 1 dimension of time that we're familiar with, even if there's just one more spatial dimension that's real, but it's outside of we just have not evolved to be in touch with it in some way. So if such a dimension exists, then that could explain a lot. You know, it certainly could explain ghosts, because if many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the book Flatland, which was written back in the late 19th century, to the idea that if you're a creature living in 2 dimensions on the surface of this gorgeous, wood table here, and then something comes in from the 3rd dimension and then leaves again, that's really weird. If you're a 2-dimensional creature, I mean, what is that? That's a ghost. I mean, it's there and then it's gone. So if that's happening in any way in a larger reality, then that could explain a lot of things. And so Smithies put that out there. and then has revisited that several times. And there's a few physicists that are actually thinking about that now in very rigorous ways. But physicists like and in string theory right now, the currently kind of accepted model of string theory has 11 dimensions. So it has the 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time, and then it has another 7 dimensions that are considered mathematical abstractions without any physical reality. Well, what if just one of them did have some physical reality to it? That kind of changes everything. So it's a way of the kind of stuff that I'm encouraging us to take a little bit more seriously may be well within the realm of an explanatory framework in some kind of future physics, where we know more and we are able to like add in another dimension or two and reconfigure our experience or how we understand time and stuff like which a lot of physicists feel is coming. So there's a lot of room for expanding just the physics to accommodate. It's not that we have to all of a sudden say, well, science is over, we can't even investigate these things anymore. That's baloney. I think science is endless, and that we'll be able to continue to get further and further insight into these things.
Well, I'm glad you got my question telepathically because you just answered it.
Oh.
Sorry. No, because really I had written down, but I thank you, Professor Presti, for interesting talk and interesting subject matter, which I'm studying myself in some degree, and I agree with you that the phenomenology of consciousness, that you could be in a drugged state, could be in a hallucinogenic state, could be in a dream state, or could be, as you described, some of these out-of-body states have a dream-like quality, or at least my dreams are kind of bizarre where I'm floating and things like that. So I think we can, and certainly dream states are physical states. And so the question you answered that I was going to ask was, do we need a separate ontology to talk about the paranormal or outside of body states rather than just rethinking our physics or expanding our physics?
Yeah.
Because maybe I'm just reading this brand new book right now that switches things around that says mind and object are the same thing. So that we need to change perspective on, the mind. In other words, I am not my body. I am not my brain. My mind is not in my body or brain. It's in a conscious state, and we're kind of just trapped into this feeling of being in the head.
Yeah, all true. Thank you.
But the final question I have is just about creativity and how you think, looking at paranormal and out-of-body states and getting away from just a physical mathematical, because in creativity we kind of escape into that out of the realm of normal rational thinking.
Yeah, well, I mean, who knows what's going on in wild creative states. The conventional neurobiological understanding of something like creativity is that the brain is extraordinarily complex, right? And there's all kinds of just variability that can happen in the kind of reconfiguring of the circuitry that's in there, and so you get periods where things just kind of reconfigure, and maybe in a dream state. Dreams are very good for that because of all of the different kind of, it may not be random, but there's different kinds of activity, different kinds of pathways are getting excited during dreams than when we're awake, and so that's an opportunity for new configurations to come up, and that is a kind of creativity. Or under the influence of psychedelics, you might reconfigure things because of the activity patterns change dramatically. But then there are, of course, also claims that there are certain examples of wild creativity in history that, how did this person ever do that? Like how did somebody like Ramanujan from your home state of Tamil Nadu, when he was a young guy, just somehow channel all of this new mathematics, seemingly out of almost nowhere. No, I don't know. I mean, whether that's the best example, but there are lots of cases like that. And so there are claims that, among people who are more inclined to think that way quickly, that they're getting that from somewhere else, some greater matrix of information, which could well be true. I mean, if there is a connectivity of mind that transcends the body in some way that allows a 3-year-old to talk in great verifiable detail about somebody else's life, then that means there are potentially ways that our mentality can plug into some kind of matrix, larger matrix of information. And then that leaves a lot of room for all kinds of wild and crazy things to happen. Yes. Okay, then you're next. Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else has read Jill Bolte Taylor's book, oh my God, what is this?
My Stroke of Insight.
Right. I mean, so she's a neuroscientist who herself experienced a stroke. And she started, she realized sometime early in the onset of the stroke that this is what was happening, and was able later to retell the entire story and the experience. And her stroke completely shut down the left hemisphere of her brain. And so she was only able to experience life, herself, her being, through the right hemisphere, which allowed her to be infinitely large, completely disconnected from her body, completely uninterested in re-entering her body, and her sense was that there is some function of the left hemisphere of our brains that encapsulates our consciousness and categorizes it and puts it into file folders and limits it. And when you disable that part, we're able to experience much more of our true essence, which is a larger consciousness, a unified sort of consciousness, and a state of pure being, of energy. And she loves, it was so painful for her to have to re-enter the physical body and to have to function through that again. But she has trained herself to be able to, through meditation, go back into that state and experience.
Yeah, I mean, this is of course we are embodied beings. Whatever else may be going on in some kind of larger matrix or whatever, if it's happening, we are, embodied beings in this moment, and so everything that we experience is in some way mediated through our body. And so when things happen to the body, like in the case of her stroke, that changes her experience in ways that she was able to articulate quite well. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I hope that I can ask this question clearly enough. I appreciate so much what you've been saying, and I feel that this conversation between science and metaphysics in some ways is it's so compelling to me. And I don't mean in my asking of this question to imply that I have a position, a fixed position on this matter, but certainly the exclusion of consciousness from the material in the positivistic agenda had metaphysical implications for sure. It had religious implications, and people didn't really necessarily always think those implications all the way through to their final conclusion, or may have had sort of convenient ways of satisficing solutions to those kinds of problems. But on the sort of flipping the whole thing and looking at it from the other perspective, I'm interested in hearing if you have the different opinions that you have encountered in the conversations that you must have had around this word about the question of ineffability, inscrutability, the unknowability of things. So what I wonder about is advance in the direction that you are suggesting seems to impinge upon certain areas of I don't know, subjective experience or metaphysics that heretofore might have been deemed sort of off limits for rational thought. and like by religious traditions or spiritual traditions, that sort of thing. And so and perhaps there's a way that categorizing things and such would make banal something that is actually like far more complex. But anyway, I just had these thoughts as you were speaking, and I wonder if you could comment on them.
Okay. David, can you give a Presti? And two, audience, please, as a courteous to Dr. Presti, would you keep your questions succinct to maybe no longer than 10 seconds and not engage in a long discourse, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll see. So I'll see if I can give a good summary. I mean, it was something like, is this territory that we're talking about here somehow, has it been considered off limits because of things that were ineffable, or it's subjective and hard to kind of, how to talk about that in a scientific way, or you're getting into the territory of religion or something like that, if I'm understanding you correctly. I also want to point out, that another one of my many heroes in the kind of history of science is William James. And I'm really not saying anything more than William James said 125 years ago. If you go back and you read William James in the 1890s, he was saying all this. He was saying we're poised. In 1892, I quote him in there. In 1892, he has this beautiful quotation. It's like,
There's a first edition of Varieties of Religion.
oh yeah, that was a late book. That was 1902. So in 1892, that's a great book. In 1892, he says, we are at the threshold of a revolution. and I use that term revolution to mean that before and after the revolution, everything changes. The way we change, the way we think about who we are and how we relate to the so-called the physical reality is different. We're not the center of the universe anymore. We're not we're not different from all other life on Earth. And space and time morph and change. They're not static, landscapes. And in quantum physics, the nature of fundamental reality is very, very weird and different from macroscopic observable stuff. So James said that this was before relativity and before quantum physics. He basically said, look, our psychology today is kind of the way chemistry was before there was Lavoisier and the notion of chemical substances that were converted from one form to elements, elements that could combine and recombine, or physics before Galileo. And I still pretty much agree with that. I don't think anything's really changed in psychology. I mean, we have a much more fundamental molecular, cellular understanding of things, but it all fits into a very kind of mechanistic worldview that goes all the way back to Galileo. And James was saying we need more than that, to really capture the essence of the mind. And one of the things we need to take seriously is this so-called, the word paranormal wasn't even around then, psychical, psi phenomena. That there's a lot of reason to believe that this can be a clue to what might be happening. And this was a major interest of his for his entire career, and he was considered the most distinguished psychologist of the day. But that all kind of got swept under the carpet with the behaviorist juggernaut of the early 20th century. So, in any case, it is tricky territory, but James was well aware of that also, and he did that whole set of lectures in Edinburgh that became the Varieties of Religious Experience, and trying to really bring together science and religion, or spiritual tradition, and look at it all in a kind of neutral way. And I consider myself an empirical scientist, but I think the conversation between the religious and spiritual traditions and the scientific worldview is the biggest and most important challenge of the modern era. I think that a lot of what's going on the planet, that's problematic, can be traced to these sort of worldview differences, and that anything that can be done to build bridges and explore the commonalities and the common interests is a good thing. And when it comes to fundamental questions of who we are as conscious beings and how we relate to the so-called physical world, that's necessarily a religious question too, because then it really does hinge upon, like, what is reality? What is, does anything happen after death or before life or whatever? You can't avoid dealing with those issues if you believe there's a lot of unexplored territory around the nature of the mind.
Kim?
Next question.
Yes.
Along those lines, I think it was Immanuel Kant that conceived of the thing unto itself, das Ding an für sich, and died in what, 1805 or something. And so now we've moved on from that to big data and the march towards singularity on the other end of the spectrum of knowledge. How does big data and all the energy that's going into technology and fusing this massive amount of information support or make more difficult your thoughts?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, big data is, it's here, and it will continue to grow and flourish and all of that. It's just like AI. People often ask, if maybe somebody was going to, like, what do I think about AI? I mean, AI is happening. We're not gonna escape it. How it may or may not inform, these sorts of questions, I don't know. But I think it's just one piece. It doesn't. This is just one piece. The big data, say, approach to things is one piece of a continued kind of set of different strands of exploration. And the real danger, though, is to believe that we can somehow reduce all of this to numbers, to data. I mean, one of the things that you see all the time, I was just looking at a website today, I was telling Presti, there's like a website, because Presti's a psychiatrist, so it's a website that was advertising kind of high-tech psychiatry, the latest gizmos, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and the best, psychopharmacology and all of that, and they had like some kind of brain, thing, and then they had like all kinds of numbers all over, numbers and circuits, and it's like, I think this kind of way of getting stuck, thinking about the only way to move forward in a deeper and more compassionate understanding of who we are and how we deal with mental suffering and all of this is to think in this very, very kind of data-oriented numbers and molecules sort of way has not been good. So that doesn't mean it should end, but it means that it really has to be balanced. You want to call on people? You call on people. Okay.
No, David, you're your guy.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just, as an educator, was it me?
No, yeah, you first.
Oh,
I
okay.
just wanted to make sure that you folks back there going, hey. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious kind of the role you think neuroscience curriculum plays into having this discussion. I was a neuro major and I was partially drawn to it because I thought there would be this blend of molecular biology and interesting psychology. But there was always this kind of border, and you were kind of seen as a cop-out for taking those cognition classes or trying to intermix those debates.
Mm-hmm.
And I know obviously some of the science has to be there for those courses to be blended together. But I'm curious in your career at Berkeley how you've seen undergrad neuroscience evolve or not evolve.
Well, I mean, I teach the introductory course in neuroscience at Berkeley, and I love molecules, so folks get a lot of molecules in there, and I started out in college as a chemistry major, and then I switched into physics and mathematics, and I grew up in the Midwest, and then I graduated with a degree in physics and math. I loved Einstein. So I was really into all of this stuff. I came to California to go to graduate school. I went to Caltech in theoretical physics, working with Kip Thorne, the guy who eventually got the Nobel Prize for gravitational waves. But I was really interested in mind and consciousness at the same time, so I was reading all this Asian philosophy that was penetrating the American culture at that time and so forth. And then I met the guy who became my graduate mentor at Caltech, Max Delbruck, who was a molecular biologist, and he advised me to study biology because if I was really interested in studying the mind, I better learn some biology, and I didn't know any. But so I have as my foundational training in science a lot of physics, math, and chemistry. So I love that stuff. And I think it's really stunningly beautiful how much we can explain things in terms of molecules and what they do. So I think that's a really important piece of the picture. However, it tends to overwhelm everything else, and so one gravitates to when it's very easy, and I think there has been a lot of this, of a field gravitating toward believing that if we can just come up with some simple molecular explanations, then we'll have a much better grip on what's going on. I call this and I know you've had both Francis Crick and Jim Watson in the store here, but I call this the double helix effect because the double helix and the genetic code, which was worked out in the 1950s, created this mindset in biology. Everybody went, oh my God, look how simple that is. It's like we thought heredity would be completely inexplicable. We would never figure out how cells stored and read out and transmitted from generation to generation information. And now it's all just this molecule that has A's and T's and C's and G's, and they're complementary, and it unwinds, and then it's like 3 of these equals that amino acid, and 3 of those equals that amino acid. Wow. And now people learn it in middle school. And back in the 1930s, when my graduate mentor started out in what would become molecular biology, this was considered the deepest mystery of science. Like, we will never figure this out. But this has created this mindset now. We just need a simple molecular explanation. Serotonin and depression. You're depressed, you have a serotonin imbalance, low serotonin, then we'll fix it with this. And if you've got addiction, your dopamine is more active, and if you now serotonin is wearing out. Now they're talking about glutamate, so maybe it's just a glutamate imbalance of some kind. And this has done psychiatry no good, to have these kinds of beliefs that we can explain this in some kind of simple molecular way. So you have to kind of do that dance. You have to do that balance to appreciate the beauty and the power of the molecular cellular explanations, and also the limitations of where those are right now, and then the really deep, wild mysteries where we have no clue how we're going to connect that to the molecules yet. And we may eventually. But so that's why I chuckle at things like people ask all the time, because another one of my big areas of interest and research interest is psychedelic medicines and so forth, and people ask all the time, what about DMT in the brain? It's like, when you have a near-death experience, isn't that just a bunch of DMT being released or something like that? It's like, no, how would you even do that experiment? But there's this desire to have a simple molecular explanation to everything, which I think is very dangerous. And so you have to dance with it. We do the best we can. Yeah, and then you're next.
Well, speaking of molecules, there was a professor of physics at UCSD in the 70s named Dr. Baron Matthias, and he had some Frontiers of Science classes, and he postulated that unusual phenomena could be like an anti-entropic effect, where the molecules in the room just zip over to one area by themselves, and that explains why it gets cold when people see ghosts.
Yeah, well, I mean, if there's something happening that's a physically discernible kind of experience, if somebody sees a ghost, then it wouldn't be at all surprising that there's some underlying molecular basis to that. I think there's a lot that can still be explained by those things. But to figure out kind of how our mentality weaves into that will be the real challenge. Yeah, thank you.